for coming out again here. I'm actually in Newberry this morning, way over on the Connecticut River, for the Connecticut River Farmers Watershed Alliance annual meeting. And if you're in that area, that's a great organization to become engaged with. If you're not in that area, but you're up in the Franklin County, Grand Isle County area, the Franklin Grand Isle Farmers Watershed Alliance meeting is next Tuesday on the 23rd. Another great organization to get involved with. So their annual meeting, Lauren or Lindsay or Kate could tell you about that and give you information if you don't know about it or know about the group. Their annual meeting will be next week at the Elks Club. So a good time to come out and learn about programs and work that farmers are doing to address water quality and climate and other issues. They do a lot of advocacy work, on all farmers' behalves. So always good to get engaged there. And then the Champlain Valley Farmers Coalition, all three similar groups, just in different parts of Vermont. Their annual meeting is next Thursday down in Addison County. And again, another great group to get engaged with if you're in that area. And same thing, just doing a lot of great work for farmers on every farmer's behalf, representing farmers at various stakeholder groups. And, like I said, having influence on policy and just really letting agencies and others know what the farming community really needs, especially, in a increasingly erratic climate, amongst other issues that we face out on farms here in Vermont. So again, I don't even know if you need to pay to be a member of any of the groups. So definitely get out and support. These are free meetings, free dinner, and lots of good information. So I would encourage everybody to go out and check it out. If you need any additional information, any one of us can let you know about those meetings. All right. So today we're going to be learning about mostly about phosphorus in the lecture today. And phosphorus is a nutrient that, is essential. We need it. We need it for life, and we need it in our soils, and we need it in our crops, and we need to eat it, not just us, our livestock, microbes. But when phosphorus moves from the soil into water, it can cause some pretty significant issues, because aquatic life, whether it's plants or the animals that live in water, they need phosphorus too, but they just don't need very much. And so, really today we'll be talking about phosphorus, the phosphorus cycle, how to really reduce risk of losing phosphorus from our farms to waterways, primarily around us. We're going to talk a little bit about the phosphorus index. Actually, we're going to talk a lot about the phosphorus index. That is the primary tool, really, that's used here in the state of Vermont to understand the risk or the potential for phosphorus to leave your farm and make its way into water. And so what we want to do is use this index to predict what the risk is from each field on your farm and really work towards minimizing that. And there are regulatory requirements around phosphorus risk here in the state. So we'll be talking about what those are and how that might impact your management. Okay, so hopefully everybody was able to get through their homework last week, and this week there'll be more homework as promised, and there'll be more of it as well. We will be working in goCrop again this week to enter manure information. So if you're importing manure onto your farm from an outside source, let's say you use like Giroux's poultry manure, or maybe you even get manure from a neighboring farm, we need to capture that in your plan. And then, of course, if you're a livestock operation and you have livestock and you're producing manure, storing manure on your farm, we need to also account for that. So we're going to show you how to put that into your plan. And then we'll also be starting to establish fields in goCrop. So putting in each one of the fields on your farm into goCrop and some of the basic soil information that goes along with each field. And that's a lot of the information that I showed you last week on the soil fact sheets. And again, if you're not getting soil fact sheets from your land treatment planner that you've been working with, they should be supplying you that information in another format because it is needed in the plan. So you'll need that information in some form. Okay, so let's move in to the presentation part today. And I feel like I'm super flexible presentation giver, giving presentations everywhere from like my truck, from a hockey rink. Now I'm in the parts shed out at Newmont Farm, which is great. It actually has heat, so I'm pretty psyched about that. All right, so I wanted to start today just talking about essential elements or nutrients for plant growth. And again, we really are only going to talk about a few of these in class, but I don't want people to leave thinking that we're only worried about or only addressing nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. I mean, by far, there are more nutrients than that than we actually need to be supplying to our plants, to the soil, to ourselves, to be able to have healthy growth. And the reason we have a strong focus on nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and often calcium and magnesium too, is because we commonly see deficiencies in our crops with those nutrients because the crops use a lot of them. Phosphorus in particular and nitrogen also, we address those because they're highly prone to loss into from our agricultural systems and can cause environmental issues. So another reason we talk about those two specifically is because of that. But again, you know, our crops need a lot of elements, and there are cases in the state, especially on farms where there is little to no manure application or organic matter amendment. Sometimes on really light textured soils, we will see micronutrient deficiencies. And so it is important to look at those values, think about the context and situation on your farm, and possibly be addressing those as well. And we will talk about micronutrients and some of the elements as well, and just really give you some guidance on when these might be deficient or even actually toxic to your animals or to your plants. But we don't spend nearly the time on all of these as we do with nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. All right, so again, you know, we break nutrients up into kind of primary, secondary macronutrients, and then micronutrients. And you can see here on this slide, you know, some of the elements that we need come from air and water. We don't think about those all that much. I think we often assume carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen are really plentiful in our systems. And, you know, we don't talk about adding carbon to the soil, although, you know, we obviously are a lot more now because of climate change. But carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, especially carbon, make up most of living material. So it's critical. And, you know, hydrogen and oxygen obviously come from air and water in the soil. And you know, that means we need to have soils that breathe and are very porous. Okay, so this is where kind of managing compaction comes into the story. The other nutrients our plants get from the soil. So the primary nutrients that we consider macronutrients, again, our plants use a lot of them, are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Then we consider secondary nutrients still needed in large amounts, but not always deficient in the soils, less so than the others, are calcium, magnesium, and sulfur. We'll dive into those a little bit, especially when we get into pH. And then we have a whole host of micronutrients that plants get from the soil. And we need those in very, very small amounts. And as I said, commonly, you know, in Vermont, we don't see a ton of deficiencies with micronutrients. The common deficiencies that we see are with boron and zinc in particular. So we do give recommendations for those two nutrients quite often. Manganese, molybdenum, we do see deficiencies and have seen deficiencies with those in Vermont. And, you know, we'll give recommendations on occasion. And then zinc and some of the other nutrients as well. Again, depending on manure application and soil condition, we may also address those too. All right. So what's really interesting is that plants they don't take up phosphorus, the element. They don't take up P. They don't take up, nitrogen, like N. They take up certain forms of these nutrients. And you can see a lot of times those forms of nutrients that the plants will take up through their roots come in different forms that have other elements with them. Okay, so as an example, nitrogen, like I said, plants don't just take up nitrogen, they will absorb through their roots NH4 plus or ammonium, or NO3 minus, which is nitrates. Okay, so these are the forms that the plants can actually absorb through their roots. So in the case of phosphorus, it's HPO4 minus 2 or H2PO4 minus. And you can see each one of these has different charges to it. You see some have a positive charge and some have a negative charge. You can see potassium is taken up as K plus, and calcium 2 plus. Okay, so these are the available forms that your plants will take out of the soil, and really no other way will they be able to utilize these nutrients. So if you're adding organic matter that has a lot of what we would call organic nitrogen, it requires that organic nitrogen, which is carbon stuck to nitrogen, to actually be broken down by the microbiology in the soil into these plant available forms. Okay, and once these plant available forms are there, they're usually in water, and that's how the plants essentially move them up through their roots into plant material. So again, different forms for different nutrients, but these are the forms that we need so that plants can actually be able to take up the nutrient. And you can see, again, they have different charges on it, right? Some have 2 plus, you can see, they have pluses and they have minuses. And this is actually very important because it impacts the mobility of the nutrient in the soil, in the water, onto the soil and into the water. So the charge is a really important point that we need to talk about because it does influence availability of nutrients. Okay, so that charge of these nutrients or elemental forms is really important for a lot of reasons, as I said. Now, what many people don't know is that your soil also has charge. So clay soil has a negative charge, or clay particles, okay? So if you have any amount of clay in your soil, it has negative charge. And the more clay you have, the more negative charges you have in your soil. Okay, so stabilized organic matter or humus. So we won't talk about this for a few classes, but organic matter also has charge, or certain forms of organic matter, and they have negative charge as well. And so why is this important? Well, I think we learned a long time ago, I want to say second grade maybe, that opposites attract. I think everybody remembers maybe that little demonstration your teacher did with magnets, where you're trying to push the magnets together and you can feel them resisting each other. So, in the soil, you have charge everywhere, and opposites attract. So those forms of nutrients that have positive charge become attracted to the negative charge on the soil particles. So that might be on clay, that might be on organic matter. So we call this the cation exchange capacity, because cations, which are those nutrients that have a positive charge, okay, those are cations, nutrients with the positive charge, are attracted to the soil that has a negative charge, okay? And the ability or the capacity of your soil to attract positively charged cations or nutrients is called the cation exchange capacity, okay, the CEC. Probably seen this on your soil test. And again, it's really important because otherwise, these positively charged nutrients are just hanging out in the soil water, or the soil matrix, mostly in the water, okay? And unless there's a plant root there to take them up, plants actively growing, and a lot of them, then those nutrients that are in water can be easily lost, right? So if they're just floating around in water, what happens to water in the soil? Well, plants take some of it up, but sometimes it drains down through the soil as well, right? So when we lose nutrients down through the soil profile in water, we call that leaching. So when you have a lot of cation exchange capacity, it basically allows you to hold on to positively charged nutrients. Now, it doesn't hold on to them forever. It doesn't mean that they're not available to your plants. What actually happens is those cations move onto and off from the soil charges based on demand often, okay? So they try to create an equilibrium for the most part. So as the plants are sucking out potassium, generally the soil will try to come into equilibrium with the water. So more potassium will move off from the soil particle. Now, something else might move on, a different nutrient or more potassium, it really depends. Some nutrients are held on stronger than others. So you can see we have some nutrients with a plus and 2 pluses, and we have some nutrients with a single plus. So those nutrients with 2 charges, or what we call a valence of 2, are actually held onto the soil a bit more tight. And so they are a little harder to get off. All right, let's see. So we often refer to yep, I think I'll leave it there. Well, we're going to cover this more when we get into your soil test. So I don't want to dig too deeply yet, because I said we're going to talk about phosphorus. So I'm going to skip over that for today. Now, one of the things I want to mention, though, is that pH, the pH of the soil, really influences the availability of many of those nutrients. And as you saw, the bases or the nutrients that influence the pH, so things that are basic, right, or things that are acidic, are generally stuck onto the soil. Okay, so you can see here on this slide, the hydrogens, which are acids, are also held onto the soil, along with calcium, which is a base. It makes things more basic. I think most of you know that, right? When you apply lime, it's calcium carbonate. So when we're liming the soil, we add bases to it to increase the pH to be more neutral, right? Around 7. Now, if we wanted to make the soil more acidic, we'd add acids. And one of the acids is hydrogen, also sulfur, and also aluminum. And again, we'll get into that more next week. All right, so the pH of the soil can really influence the availability of nutrients. Okay, and we can see a lot of problems when we have very acid soils versus very alkaline soils. So taking care of the soil pH is really, really important to growing high yielding and healthy crops. And actually, I feel like, you know, Vermont is a place where most parts of Vermont have traditionally lower pHs, except in the Champlain Valley. But most of the other places around us, as you kind of move up into the hills, generally struggle with low pHs. And so we really need to make sure that we keep the pH more neutral, okay, closer to 7, so that we can grow the healthiest crops possible, and also have the best soil health, because microbes, actually, the ones we want, also benefit from pHs that are more basic. Okay, so this just sort of outlines some of the issues that are created when you have very acidic soils. So you end up, you know, getting toxicity from certain nutrients like aluminum and manganese. And then you can have deficiency of other nutrients, right? So if it's a very acidic soil, you have more acids like aluminum, and you have less bases like calcium and magnesium. If you had a lot of calcium, the soil would be more basic, more alkaline, and you might have the opposite problem. Okay, so really just the point is, you know, keep those pHs in a range that is conducive for the crop that you're growing. And for most crops, that range is between 6.2 and 6.8. You don't actually want a soil really above 7, because you run into other issues, and most nutrients are most available at that kind of slightly acidic range. Okay. So again, pH really affects nutrient availability, but again, it really impacts biology as well. And biology is really important, especially, well, in all of crop production, but especially when we start talking about nitrogen. And all the transformations that, again, we'll get into more deeply in the next couple of weeks, all the transformations that happen with nitrogen, from becoming bound to organic matter to being broken down into the plant available forms, into other plant available forms, or even lost as greenhouse gases. That's all driven by the microbiology in the soil. And so again, much of that microbiology really needs pHs above 6. Now, phosphorus, which we're gonna, I promise, start talking about here really soon, is highly, highly affected by the pH of the soil. I guess that's why I'm talking about all this as a preamble to getting into phosphorus. But phosphorus binds very, very quickly to aluminum and iron if you have a low pH, so if you have an acidic soil. And if you have a high pH, it will bind very, very tightly with calcium, okay? So this can be positive, it can be negative. It depends on your situation. So, as an example, one of the ways that folks are trying to manage phosphorus levels in water, like in certain lakes, enclosed lakes, they add a product called alum, which is aluminum. And the reason they do that is to trap excess phosphorus that's made its way into the lake. And so they may try to line the bottom of a lake with alum. I've also heard of people trying to add this to soils that have really, really saturated phosphorus levels as well. So again, it can be used in a way to kind of clean up saturated soils or waterways. We certainly don't want to get there. That's what we're trying to keep from happening on your farms. But if you do have a very acidic soil or a soil that's really high in aluminum, it probably has a bunch of phosphorus attached to it. And honestly, that is not plant available. And in order to make it plant available, you need to raise the pH to a point where some of that phosphorus will disassociate from the acids or the bases and become available to your plants. So this has actually been quite an issue in Vermont for a long time, up until, I would say more recently. And it still remains an issue for many farms today. When you take a soil test and you see your aluminum levels are really high, but your phosphorus levels, available phosphorus is kind of low, chances are if you lime the soil, those available phosphorus levels in your soil test will go up, because some of that phosphorus that's bound up and not available to the plants will be released. Okay, so we'll talk about this a bit more. And then, of course, pH affects potassium as well, and a higher pH. So once we get to alkaline soils, or even a liming event, will release a lot of potassium into the soil, right? Because if you're liming, you're adding a lot of calcium. And I think hopefully you remember, it was just a few minutes ago, I said calcium has more charge and it's stronger. So it's stronger than potassium. So when you lime, if you have potassium on the soil binding sites, chances are the calcium will displace it. And so then you'll end up with a big release of potassium into the soil water. All right. So again, our real goal here, first and foremost, when you're looking at your soil tests, is really to be evaluating that pH. That's generally the first thing I look at to get a sense of, are we in the optimum range? And if we're not, that's generally one of the first things that I'll do or recommend, because you can add a lot of fertilizer to a soil that has a low pH and definitely not get out of it what you should be, because of all the things I just talked about. So again, if you have a pH that's low, you're going to want to be thinking about liming. And this graph here just shows you where the nutrients are most available. And you can see sort of in that slightly acidic to slightly alkaline system, that's kind of our happy, sort of happy ground. Okay, so sometimes when your soil gets really acidic, you can see that some of these micronutrients could get released. And they could actually be released at levels that are very toxic to your plants. So it's not necessarily great that we reduce the pH and get a huge output of micronutrients. So again, just balancing that is probably one of the first things you want to pay attention when you start looking at your soil test. Okay, so with phosphorus and managing phosphorus, it can be challenging because of what I just talked about. How when we're adding phosphorus to the soil, whether it's phosphorus from manure or phosphorus fertilizer, some type of phosphorus fertilizer, it is immediately attracted to these other elements. So those little yellow dots are phosphorus that was added to the soil, okay? So unless you have a plant root right next to where those phosphorus forms are, you know, it'll likely get bound up really, really, really quickly to these other elements, okay? So this sounds not, this doesn't sound right to a lot of people, but phosphorus is not very mobile in the soil. Okay, so people always say, well, then why is it making it into the lakes and the streams? Well, we'll talk about that. But when you place phosphorus into the soil, it doesn't really move all that far from where you put it. Even with 30 inches of rain, it barely moves. So in order for a plant root to have access to phosphorus, it actually needs to come in contact with it. Okay, so it's not like other nutrients that sort of move readily through water or through the soil. Phosphorus isn't that way. So that's why if you're adding phosphorus, you need that, and you need it, you need to make sure that you have, you know, growing plants so that the nutrient can get to the root versus being absorbed by the soil. All right, so you can see it happens pretty quickly. So again, you know, this is probably one of the this is one of the reasons why when we add starter fertilizer, let's say to corn seed, we try to put it pretty close to the seed, right? So we put the phosphorus relatively close so that when that little root comes out, it can easily access those nutrients. It doesn't have to try to grow too much to be able to get the phosphorus. All right. Okay. So again, phosphorus itself is, you know, it's an essential nutrient. I feel like it definitely has gotten a bad name in Vermont. And, you know, many farmers, I feel like, are afraid of it and don't even want to, you know, talk about it, especially when they need phosphorus fertilizer. You know, but if you need phosphorus, you need to be adding it. It's absolutely essential for metabolism and reproduction and photosynthesis and cell, you know, all kinds of essential functions in our plants and our animals. So if you need phosphorus, we want you to put it on the fields, but we want to make sure that we're minimizing any risk of loss, okay? Because as I said, once phosphorus gets away from our farms and into the water, that's where we start to see issues. And it doesn't take very much, again, to make a problem in water. Our crops and our animals definitely need a lot more phosphorus than, again, aquatic life. So again, it's managing what we need and minimizing the losses. All right. So part of the issue, you know, goes back to what I just talked about, is that phosphorus levels in the soil are generally low compared to the other nutrients. And much of the phosphorus in our soils is actually unavailable because it gets bound up so quickly by these other elements. So when you get your soil test back, what it's actually measuring is just what's available. It's not measuring the total phosphorus in your soil. We used to call it reserve phosphorus. So really what you're getting is just a view of what the plants have access to. And hopefully that's enough to grow the crop, because the phosphorus does move, like I said, pretty slowly, you know, from the soil particles to the water and then to your plants. Okay, and again, you know, just phosphorus has such an affinity to these other nutrients. If you need phosphorus, you have to manage this, because you don't want the soil kind of absorbing all that phosphorus and then again, your plant not getting enough. This is really common. You know, I give this example because it's a common one. not as much in Vermont anymore, but potato growers traditionally will grow potatoes under very low pH. They actually try to keep the pH low to minimize diseases of the tubers, right? So remember I said microbes don't like low pH either, or many of them. So potato farmers historically have tried to keep the pH really low to minimize pathogen infection of the tubers. Well, at the same time, what happens is that they need to add a lot more phosphorus to be able to supply, because potatoes actually utilize a lot of phosphorus, to be able to get the potatoes enough phosphorus to grow. So they end up adding 3-4 times the amount of phosphorus that the crop actually needs. Because when they add that phosphorus, it gets bound up so quickly by the acids in the soil, they barely have enough left to meet the need of the potato crop. Now, obviously, if you do that over time, you will end up with soils that become really saturated with phosphorus. And again, that's not what we want to do. Now, we have seen this happening in Vermont, where we do end up getting saturated soils because of some of this historic large quantities of phosphorus being put on the fields to meet crop demand. We didn't really think, 60, 70, 80 years ago that soils could actually become saturated with phosphorus. We just didn't think that was possible, but we have since found that that is very possible and makes our fields more risky from a water quality perspective, because once you get so much phosphorus in there, the chance of loss and now even leaching, okay, phosphorus normally doesn't move. Remember I said that? So normally we would never think that we'd lose phosphorus from leaching. But when soils become super saturated and all that phosphorus starts hanging out in the water pool, right? Instead of binding onto the soil, we start to lose it down through the soil profile. So again, this is what we're trying to manage in class. And by doing a nutrient management plan is to keep you from overloading the soil with phosphorus. All right. So, we've seen this with crops, like potatoes. I gave an example, but we obviously also see this on livestock farms, and that saturation, comes for a different reason, actually. And so, part of the reason we start to see saturation or really high levels of phosphorus on some of our dairy farm fields, usually not every field on a farm, usually it's like 1 or 2, is because, again, we've added more phosphorus than what the crop actually really needs in any given year. And so when we do that, it just continues to build up the phosphorus levels in the soil over time. And because that phosphorus doesn't leach, it doesn't move slowly down through the soil profile, it actually builds up over time. So, we theoretically could be doing the same thing with nitrogen, potassium, sulfur, but because those don't bind as tightly to the soil, we actually lose more of that down through the soil profile. Now, of course, we hope that's in a sustainable manner, right? Over time, we're not losing lots and lots every year, of course, but a natural amount of nutrients moving down through the soil profile is fine. But again, because we've been adding often more phosphorus than what our crops need in the form of manure, we get that buildup. And we're trying to manage that now because we know it's happening. We didn't really know that before. I wish we did. We probably wouldn't be in this situation. But if this is a situation on your farm, that's what we're trying to manage. Okay. So how is this happening? This is just an example, very very basic. So here's, analysis of liquid manure to the left. So in 1,000 gallons, we have 15 pounds of nitrogen. And in 1,000 gallons of manure, we have 8 pounds of phosphorus, right? So typical, very typical, in our farm fields for corn, we see needs. And these needs right here are based on the soil test, soil type, and also crop production. So, an average recommendation for the crop is 40 pounds of phosphorus with 150 pounds of nitrogen. So again, you can see here, like I mentioned before, crops need a lot more nitrogen than they do phosphorus, okay? So when we're using manure to supply our nitrogen needs, what ends up happening is that we end up over applying phosphorus, okay? So you can see here, if I want to apply the amount of manure that the crop needs to meet the nitrogen demand, I would put on 10,000 gallons of manure, okay? That's a rate that's commonly used on corn, 8 to 10,000 gallons. And you can see it would supply 150 pounds of nitrogen, but it would also supply 80 pounds of phosphorus. But the crop only needs 40, okay? So then we have 40 left. And if we do that year after year after year, and we always have 40 left, you can see how that will begin over time. And it actually takes quite a long time to do this. The soils will just start increasing in phosphorus over time. So what we want to make sure that we're doing is that we're balancing the need of the crops with the soil test levels of phosphorus and the nutrients that we're putting on the field, because we don't want those levels to be building up too high, okay? We want our soil test levels to be adequate, and we want to be adding nutrients, to the extent that's needed, but not over apply. All right. So what we've found over time in Vermont, of course, is that, we are building up phosphorus on our farms, mostly, because of some of the issues I talked about, too much manure based on what the crop needs, but also we're importing a lot of phosphorus onto our farms, and we're not exporting as much away. So most of our phosphorus that comes on the farms in Vermont comes through grain that we're buying, okay? There's not a lot of phosphorus fertilizers, chemical fertilizers that are purchased anymore. Mostly what I see, is in corn starter, very low amounts. But overall, farmers are using the manure to supply the phosphorus needs of their crop. Okay, but the fact that they're importing more phosphorus onto their farms in the form of feeding bedding versus what's going off of the farm in the form, in many cases, milk, or meat, or even crops, that means that over time we're building up phosphorus on our farms, okay? So again, we're really trying to manage all this to keep those levels in an acceptable area. And that's been difficult for some farms, especially farms that have been in production a really, really long time. This is one of the reasons why we want to make sure you have enough land base for the amount of nutrients you're producing, right? Because we don't want to over apply on a small amount of land, because that will lead to more buildup. So we have a lot to manage to try to make sure that phosphorus levels in the soil kind of stay at a point where the crops are benefiting and we're protecting the environment. So, it is a challenge for some, and for others of you, you'll be needing phosphorus. You may need even more manure. You may need more fertilizer. So again, it really depends on the farm, but this is, part of the situation and why there's such a focus on phosphorus here in Vermont. All right. So the phosphorus cycle itself is pretty boring, actually. When you see the nitrogen cycle, you'll see how exciting that is. I'm sure everybody will be waiting for that. But yeah, the phosphorus cycle is it's kind of boring. Phosphorus, comes from rocks originally, right? So weathering rocks, it's mined currently and made into fertilizer products. There is, predictions that the like mined and processed phosphorus that's available for growing crops is diminishing, and that the sources will be depleted by 2050, which isn't that far away. But of course, in most places in Vermont and other livestock areas, we have an overabundance of phosphorus. So we're not, worried so much about that. We're trying to manage all the phosphorus we have, but many, many places around the globe are very phosphorus deficient. So maybe we're sitting on a gold mine. All right, so we get phosphorus, to our plants. Most people from manure phosphorus or, some kind of livestock manure, not always dairy, but beef or sheep, goats. And then we have fertilizer phosphorus that's purchased. And again, this is generally some kind of synthetic processed product. There is a product called rock phosphate that organic producers can buy, but it's not very available. It's rocks, so it has to break down, and that takes quite a bit of time. So you can see when you add manure phosphorus and fertilizer phosphorus into the soil, a bunch of that phosphorus will go into the solution P. So again, the solution P is water with nutrients in it, orthophosphate. Okay, so that's the available form. And that's the solution P is what the plants can actually use. So we get a bunch of that directly right when we add manure. It's 100% available. Now with fertilizer phosphorus, as I mentioned, a lot of it will become fixed, pretty tightly to soil. Some of it goes into what we call labile pool, which means it's available, but more slowly. But ultimately, we need to get that phosphorus into the solution. And I've already sort of described the challenges with that, from pH to, the different types of minerals you have in your soil, clay particles, etc. All of that affects the availability of phosphorus. But overall, we're adding manure. The manure has a good amount, often too much phosphorus for our crops. And we don't have a ton of problems with meeting the demands of our crops. But as I said, in some cases, we certainly do. All right. So as I mentioned before, phosphorus is not very mobile in the soil. We lose it by losing soil primarily, not by losing phosphorus. Okay. And we'll talk about that in a minute. But you can see here in a field, this is showing that concept, I guess, that phosphorus doesn't move much in the soil. So you can see there are different levels of phosphorus application shown here. So you have no manure, you have manure added at 40 pounds of P per acre per year, you have 90 pounds of P per acre per year, and then you have 110 pounds of P per acre per year. And then across the top there is soil test phosphorus. And then you have soil depth to the side. So when you're adding 110 pounds of phosphorus per acre per year, you can see most all of that phosphorus stays in the top 5 inches of the soil, right? Or it will stay in the tillage zone if you're tilling your soil. it doesn't go much lower than that. So you can see once you hit 10, 15, 20 inches down, the level of phosphorus goes way down. And again, that's because it's not moving down through the soil profile. Once you get the soil saturated, of course, then that kind of changes everything. But in general, you can see that where you put that phosphorus is basically where it stays. So this is why it's also extremely, extremely important that we're protecting the top of the ground from erosion, right? Because all that phosphorus is sitting right, right in that top layer. And as we start to lose that top layer soil to erosion, water, wind, whatever, and it's moving that soil somewhere else, generally someplace it shouldn't be, then that's when we really, really run into problems. Because there's, depending on the soil test, there could be a lot of phosphorus stuck there. Okay. So again, the amount of phosphorus that causes an issue, in aquatic systems is very low. So you can see the critical phosphorus level here for crop growth versus the critical level of phosphorus for algae growth. So, losing really any amounts of phosphorus is, sets a water system way out of balance. And that's why we need, again, to minimize both the loading of our soils, right? So we don't want those soils building up too high in phosphorus, but we also need to manage the losses. So loading and then transport. So those are the two things that we're trying to manage in this class. We want to keep the phosphorus on the fields, and we want to make sure that we're not overloading the fields with too much. Okay, so this is a huge balancing act that we're trying to do here in this class, and then hopefully you implementing on your farm as well. Okay, so as I said before, we want to make sure that we're reducing the risk of runoff and leaching, erosion, while also managing that loading. So let's talk a little bit about losses of phosphorus into our system. Just get this whole thing going here. There we go. Okay, so we're really looking at managing transport. Okay, so as I said, we want to make sure that the phosphorus is not leaving those fields. Now, we won't really get leaching. It's pretty rare, but again, it can happen. And, some of that has to do with oversaturation. Unfortunately, some of it has to do with soil quality. Sometimes really, really high quality soils get big pores in them and can actually lose phosphorus that way. Sometimes, if you're on a clay soil down in Addison County and you get those big cracks in the clay, you go out and apply manure, and the manure goes right down the crack. That can make its way down to a tile line, let's say, and then make its way into water. But again, those are, I don't want to say minor situations. We deal with those as they come and make people aware that we can lose phosphorus that way. But the primary way that we lose phosphorus into the, surface water here in Vermont is erosion, which is why there's been so much push for cover cropping. Okay. And making sure that the ground always has some kind of growing plant on it to reduce the amount of soil loss. And, we get soil loss. We have these slopes in Vermont often. We're growing corn silage, which is a great crop and a great feed for dairy cattle and other livestock. But, it also has a lot of open ground, a lot of open soil. It can, it requires us to remove all the biomass off the field. So there are periods when the ground is completely bare, especially, post-harvest. And that again is why we're really, adamant and pushing people to grow cover crops. We want to keep the soil where it should be and where you should want it to be in your field, right? I'm still paying my farm mortgage, and I probably will be for most of the rest of my life. and I'm paying on the land, right? So again, you don't want to lose your soil. And especially, I just showed you that top bit of your soil is where all the nutrients are, is where all your investment is where, the crops are growing. So we want to protect that. And when soil erodes, again, if you have high levels of phosphorus or even low, and it's stuck to the soil, because I said that's what happens, right? It has a high affinity for the nutrients that are stuck on your soil. If you're losing soil, there's phosphorus stuck to it. Okay. Even if you have a depleted soil, there's still some phosphorus stuck to it. But the higher the phosphorus levels you have in the soil, the more risk that's there. Okay. So minimizing erosion, or what we call the loss of sediment bound P, is really, really critical. And that's why we have a requirement for buffers. Okay. Buffers, 25-foot buffers. We talked about this last week along surface water. That's sort of the last ditch effort to make sure that soil doesn't make it into a waterway or manure with nutrients attached to it. All right. So there are reason for, the request to do all these things. And, we have soils that are prone to erosion. And there's other ways to address that, but one of them is to have something growing there all the time. Slow that water down and hold on to that soil. All right. So we also lose phosphorus, not just bound to soil. Okay. There's also dissolved phosphorus, and that is phosphorus free in water. And again, if you apply fertilizer, let's say to the surface, let's say you broadcast it on a hayfield, or you apply manure also, and let's say you broadcast it on a hayfield, okay, and then we get a rain event. There oftentimes will be free phosphorus, okay, that would be readily available for your crops to take up, that disassociates into the water. Okay. And we call that dissolved phosphorus. And that actually is more difficult to manage. This is generally more of a problem on hayfields, and also a problem on fields, that now are no-till. So where phosphorus fertilizers and manure are not incorporated into the soil, and they're left on the soil surface. Okay. So they become more at risk for actual runoff. Now, dissolved phosphorus, generally, it's not always stopped by a buffer either, right? A buffer along the edge will slow the water down, right? And the sediment will drop out of it, hopefully. So it'll help with sediment P, but it doesn't always help with dissolved phosphorus. Oftentimes, that water moves right through, the sediment may drop out, but there still may be a lot of phosphorus free in water. Okay. So the best way to minimize this type of phosphorus loss is to make sure when it rains, the water goes into the ground and doesn't run across the ground. And so we need to have soils that are very permeable, high infiltration rates. And again, growing cover crops, growing crops with big root systems, no-till, maintaining the overall health and permeability of the soil, reducing compaction. All of those things will help water move down through the soil instead of across. Okay, so that's really our goals for managing phosphorus. Okay, so we know there's a lot of things that can affect soil erosion. I already talked about this, the slope of our fields, the texture of the soil, the type of tillage we're using, the type of crop we're growing, what direction we grow it across the slope. All of these things will affect soil erosion. And same with runoff potential. So the movement of that dissolved phosphorus, we have a lot of clay fields in the Champlain Valley, and they're very prone to runoff because they're not that permeable. And that's a problem. So we're trying to work on that with better soil management and always having something growing. So, of course, it's really hard to control soil movement and runoff, especially at like the significant rain events that we've received. but we have to do our best. And, you know, we can continue to improve here. All right, so we know phosphorus, already talked about this, in runoff comes from manure directly applied to the ground and also from fertilizers. You know, this is definitely, you know, the biggest issue here is primarily on hay fields, where things aren't incorporated, and sometimes on no-till fields as well, where there's not maybe enough residue. But also if you have a lot of phosphorus, high soil test phosphorus in that top couple inches of soil, that phosphorus can dissociate, you know, as the water is moving, and really cause some issues. So there's a lot of things to manage here to reduce transport. All right. So again, you know, kind of skip through this so we can get to the phosphorus index. Okay. So the phosphorus index is the tool that we use to predict risk. You know, what's the risk of your management, texture, the slope of the field, you know, the amount of rainfall, which is unpredictable. But, you know, with all those factors in mind, what is the risk of losing phosphorus, both sediment bound and dissolved phosphorus, from each field on your farm? And that is what will be, you know, running in goCrop. I'm going to show you the tool so you can see how it works and what goes into it. But as you're filling out goCrop with all the information from your farm in the background, it will be calculating the risk for phosphorus loss from each field on your farm. So you already know some of the things that are going to impact that, right? So the slope of your field, the type of soil you have, how high the phosphorus levels are in your soil, where and when you're applying manure. Like, are you incorporating the manure? Because we know incorporation reduces dissolved phosphorus. Are you surface applying it? How much are you putting on? How high is the aluminum in each one of your fields, right? Because aluminum binds to phosphorus. So all of those pieces that go into goCrop will chug in the background and then will give you a phosphorus risk assessment for that field. All right, so what does all that mean once you have that assessment? Okay, so once all the pieces are in place, you'll get a score. Okay, you'll have a low phosphorus index, which means low risk, or maybe you'll have a medium phosphorus index, which means medium risk, high risk, very high risk. Okay, so really the goal here is to keep your fields in the medium to low risk categories. That's what we want. We definitely want to make sure we're adjusting management if you're in the very high category. Okay, if you're very high risk for losing phosphorus, there's a lot of regulations around that, like you can't apply any more manure. So if you have a field that is very high risk, no more manure application, no more phosphorus fertilizers. And then you have to, you know, deploy other strategies to basically bring those phosphorus levels down and make sure that that field, you know, has strategies in place to reduce erosion, etc. Okay, so maybe there are practices that you can put into place or are willing to put into place to go from very high even to medium. Okay, so as you work in the system, you'll realize the factors that influence the P index. If you have a high P index, there are some regulations around that. And also if you have a medium P index, okay? And those regulations are around loading. Okay, remember I said when we add more phosphorus than what our crop removes, we start building up the phosphorus levels in the soil. They become more risk and more risk. So if you have a medium or a high P index, you have to make sure that you're not applying more phosphorus than what your crop is going to remove in that year. Okay, so that you don't keep building up the soil. So that is one of the regulations. So it may mean on some fields you have to reduce your manure rate, or change the way your rotation possibly, etc. So there are a lot of different things we can do to try to make sure you're meeting the regulations and reducing your phosphorus risk. But again, when you start falling into these different categories, there are regulatory requirements around those. Now, all of this, it's in your binders. If you're concerned about it and want to know more details, you can read up on it. We will be diving into this because we can't approve plans, if you have a high P index and you're not doing what's asked of you, okay, which is making sure you're not over applying phosphorus to what the crop needs. Okay. All right. So let me just show you an example of that. I'll go back here. In this example, very similar to what I showed you before. Here's a soil test for this crop. It says the crop needs 40 pounds of phosphorus, and that's based on what's in the soil. Soil has a medium level of phosphorus. And so it says, well, this crop, to get what the crop needs, you actually only need to apply 40 more pounds. Okay. There's also phosphorus available from the soil, so you don't need to apply more than 40 pounds. Okay. So if we go back to our example here, similar example, we said, well, the crop needs 40 pounds of phosphorus. This field has a medium P index. Okay. So because it has a medium P index, we're not allowed to add more phosphorus than what that crop is going to remove in that year. Okay. So how much phosphorus will the crop remove? Now above it says, well, 40 pounds, right? No. Okay. What the soil test says is based on what's already in the soil, if you add 40 more pounds, the crop will have enough phosphorus. Okay. Now in our example, we were adding 80 pounds, and based on the soil test, that was 40 more pounds than what we needed based on what's already in the soil. Okay. So how do we meet the P index, right? And the regulations. So again, if you have a medium or a high P index, you cannot add more phosphorus than what a crop will remove, whatever crop you're growing, in a single year of production. Okay, so here's just an example for corn. So if you go over to the end, you can see a typical yield. Let's say it's 20 tons, and this is based on your yields. Okay, so let's say a typical yield for that field is 20 tons. So for that yield, the crop will remove from the soil 80 pounds of phosphorus, right? So again, you are meeting the regulation if you're adding 80 pounds of phosphorus, because the crop will remove that amount, okay? But again, it's not necessarily sustainable. You may keep the soil test from moving up more and loading more, and maybe, over time, possibly draw it down. But again, just be aware that, if you get a medium P index or high, this is the kind of stuff we're going to have to look at for each field on your farm. Okay. All right. So that's phosphorus and the phosphorus index. And I just quickly wanted to show you the phosphorus index so that you can see. Okay. So you can see what that looks like and see everything that goes into it. This is an Excel spreadsheet, but it is built into goCrop. So you won't have to use the Excel spreadsheet. In the old days, we had to do it by hand. So we're kind of lucky now. But just like in school, I want you to see what's happening before I give you the calculator. So you can see here to the left, it tells you the P index of this field is 64. The interpretation is high. Okay, so it falls in the high category. If you look down below, you can see pathway 1 sediment bound. So that's from erosion. Okay, 41 of the score comes from sediment bound, which means most of the phosphorus being lost from this field is in the form of erosion. So if we're going to do something to bring down the P index, we need to stop erosion. Okay? If it was high in dissolved phosphorus, we'd have to do something to manage that. Okay, so you can see it asks for the county you live in, the elevation. So all these things are important for like rainfall, and also, weather conditions. It asks you the soil test level. I put in 5 here. The aluminum level, let's see, I'll put it in 100. Okay, didn't really change the phosphorus index. Okay, and then it asks for manure rates. How much manure phosphorus are you adding? So you can see here, 50 pounds of phosphorus added May through September. It was injected into the ground and it was applied immediately. Okay, and it was dairy manure. And then if you put on multiple rates, you add that in as well. So you can see here, if I add another rate of manure, you can see immediately the score starts to go up. Let's see if I just put here. Okay. Didn't go up a lot, but it went up a little bit. Okay. It's asking me for timing. Okay, there. All right, so you can see by adding more manure, I just went into the very high category, which means I can't do that because I can't apply any manure if I'm in the very high rate. Okay. So you add in your manure applications, you add in fertilizer, how that's applied. You need to use those erosion numbers that you selected last class. Remember that? We went through the tolerable soil loss. That is what, that's the level you have to meet. Okay. And then you had to select your predicted soil loss from what you're growing and the type of soil and management you have on your farm. And that has to meet T. So what you put here is the yearly soil loss that's predicted from that field. Okay. You don't put T. You don't put what you have to meet. You put what is theoretically predicted to happen. So in this case, I'm going to say, well, okay. So you can see if the erosion level is lower, then my P index goes down. Okay. You also have to put in things like how much of the ground is covered. So the more cover you have, like a perennial crop, the less risk of erosion, but maybe the more risk, for dissolved phosphorus loss. You also have to put what crop you're growing. And then you have to put in a couple of other items. One is called total distance from the field edge to any water conveyance. Okay. So this is how far your field is from surface water. And then you also have to put in the vegetated buffer width between the field edge and water. So everybody knows that the required buffer size is 25 feet. Okay, so you should never have a field right up to water. This should never be 0, because if it's 0, it means you don't have a buffer. Okay, so the minimum this can be is 25. Okay, and then it asks you what your manure spreading setback distance is within the field. Now, the vegetated buffer is different from the manure spreading setback. Okay? It's in addition to the buffer. So you can't spread manure in the buffer. You cannot spread manure in that 25 feet, whether it's a hayfield or it's a vegetated buffer along a cornfield. You are not to be spreading manure there. Okay, that is your vegetated buffer. Do you have a setback in addition to that? So this is extra. So let's say you have a sloped field and the 25-foot buffer, you want more than that. So I have another 25-foot spreading setback. Again, that means you're 50 feet. When you're spreading, you're 50 feet from water. All right. Okay, and then it asks you if you have tile drainage. So this is pattern tile, not, orphan tiles. So this is tiles that have been installed generally somewhat recently, but it's usually pattern tile that's occurring maybe every 25 feet or so, right? So I just wanted to give you a look at the phosphorus index, and how it's calculated and the items that go into it. So you can see again that depending on, a bunch of different factors, we can move that P index up or down. Okay, and some have more weight than others. So this says total distance of field from the edge, 5 feet. Okay. And so, if you get a high P index, or especially if you get a very high P index, we want to make sure that you're thinking about all the options that you have to reduce those numbers. We want to make sure that we're reducing that risk as much as possible. Okay, so you can see the things that influence that, from the amount of manure you're putting on, the amount of fertilizer, when you're applying it, the soil test levels, the soil type. So some things you can change, some things you can't. Okay, and some fields are just really difficult. Those really heavy clay soils are going to be very difficult for many people to kind of manage and reduce risk. But we'll, look at all avenues. And again, it's really about coming up with options that, you will actually implement to reduce that risk, especially for those of you that are regulated, because you will be inspected, and you want to make sure that you're able to implement, the strategies that you've written in your plan. One thing I want to go over, and this is in your book as well, the Digging In book, there are a bunch of examples of distance to stream and buffers, because this can get very complicated. And, sometimes the district folks help with this, and they will, give you this information, but sometimes not. So I just wanted to show you a couple of examples of distance to stream versus vegetated buffer versus manure setback. Okay, so here's 2 fields. You can see field 1, field 2, see the vegetated buffer and the waterway, the surface water. Okay, the kind of brown hatch marks that you see, that shows where manure has been applied to those fields. Okay, and those fields they're brown underneath there too, so they're an annual crop. Okay, so you have field 1 and 2, both annual crops, being grown right next to each other, and both of them have manure applied to it. All right, so let's talk about field 1. What is the total distance from that field to the stream? Okay, so it's 300 feet. What is the vegetated buffer between that field and the stream? Now, some people would want to put 300 feet, but because that other field has manure spread on it, it's actually only 25 feet, okay? Because there's no area where there isn't manure spread on it from field 1 to the water conveyance, okay? And then it asks what the setback is, the manure spreading setback, and there isn't one on this field. So let's look at field number 2 now, and you can see the distance to stream from this field is 25 feet, okay? Because the vegetated buffer is not considered your field anymore, right? It's considered the buffer. Obviously, you still own it. So in this case, you would not put 0. You would not put, my field goes right up to the water. Okay, it's actually 25 feet from the water where you're cropping. And then it asks what the vegetated buffer width is. And you can see that is 25. Okay, so now you can see an area of field number 2 that doesn't have manure on it. That is an additional spreading setback within the field, okay, on top of the buffer. So you can refer to these examples as you're filling out goCrop. You'll need this information today to make sure you're filling it out properly. And again, the districts have been great in providing a lot of that information for people. So you may not have to use the examples. But again, you do need to have that vegetated buffer, whether you have a row crop or you have grass. You can see next to the example I just showed, that's an example of a grass field, and you still have to have a vegetated buffer with no manure spread on it, you know, along water. So just some examples there. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing. All right, it is lunchtime, and I'm wondering if we want to go through the homework or if we want to wait and do that after lunch, or should we just push through it and finish it up? What do you think, Lindsay?
I heard a vote in a whisper format for do it now.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. Okay, so let's go through our homework quickly. And if you need additional help, please reach out to, you know, the technical service provider you're working with. So I'm back into goCrop. And this hopefully is starting to look familiar to folks. You want to go into work with your farm. And I think Lindsay did this last week, but down below in record years, you want to make sure you have the 2023 year there. So it's very easy to add, just add, put in whatever year. So we already put 2023, 2024. I also put 2022. I'm going to add 2021 as well. So if you have any soil tests or manure tests that are not from 2024, but likely from 2023, maybe from 2022, okay, you need to have that year kind of outlined in your plan. So that's why you need to add it here. So if you haven't added a 2023 year, you definitely need to do that. And I guess maybe adding a 2022 year as well. All right, so what do we need to do this week? We're going to start adding fields. So the fields that will be in your plan, you're going to start adding them into goCrop, and you're going to start adding the soils data this week. So let's go through that. So go to fields, and you can see I already have one added in here. But I'm going to start from scratch, and I'm going to add a new field. Okay, so again, you got to add each field that you're including in your plan. So you put your field name, what you call it, the acreage size. This should come off the FSA maps or your maps that you have. And included since when, if you're writing the plan for the first year, or your soil test is from 2023, you can put that. Doesn't really matter all that much at this point. Is it owned or leased? And then what county is it in? Okay. So again, you can see save field. So you can save it now. You added some data. Okay, and now it shows up, but there's not much here. So I want you to go back in. And you can see there's some other sections that I want you to fill out. I want you to fill out this top soil section. You can add a map area if you want. And then I also want you to fill out these Vermont NMP field details. Okay. And this is where a lot of the information we talked about today and last week will come into play. All right. So I'm going to hit edit the field. I already filled out the top part. I created the field. All right. So I'm in the town of St. Albans here. Not a lot of places to have a field, but I guess I'm going to have it right here. Okay, so you can outline your fields if you want. This does take time to do, but it can be very helpful. Okay, so I'm updating it, and it does connect to additional soil data. So kind of recommend it, makes it a little bit easier. Okay, so I did that. So now it says soils, and you can see there's soil type, drainage class, hydrologic group, flood potential. Where does all this data come from? Depth to bedrock, water table depth. So this all comes off from those soil fact sheets. So again, you may or may not have those. Generally, if you don't have them, the districts have been providing this information in a big spreadsheet for you, but you do need it. Now, if you outlined on the map, you can hit fill based on field area, and it will fill in the soil type, as you can see here, and all the information that goes along with it, with the exception of depth to bedrock. Okay, again, this should be on the soil fact sheets or other information you've gotten from the districts. Okay. Now below it's more details. You need the FSA track and field number, and it needs to be entered the way we have it shown here. So it has the track dash field number. Then it asks you the vegetative buffer width. What is the minimum buffer width that should be listed here at all times? You cannot not have a buffer, okay? So make sure it has at least 25 feet. Then it says, do you have an additional spreading setback? And this is where we see a lot of errors. Most of the time this is no, I don't have any, okay? And then it asks you, does the soil have living vegetation in April? So is this field in hay? Is it have a cover crop growing on it? Or is it a silage field, no cover crop? So it kind of yes or no. And then does it have tile drainage? And again, just yes or no. And then it asks about a sediment track structure. You'll see these here, terraces, ponds, wascobs, dispersion. I'm pretty sure if you have one of those, you would know it. Most people are just going to hit no. Okay, and this is a lot of information, again, that's going into the P index that we just looked at. Okay, so it asks you your elevation. Again, this information should be provided by the districts in spreadsheets, maps, fact sheets, and same with distance to stream. So how far is that field from a water conveyance? And in this case, I'm going to say 25 feet. Is it frequently flooded? No. And what is the nitrogen leaching index? Again, this should be provided by the districts. We used to get a map. I believe it's just listed at this point, but you do need this information. And again, this is the risk of leaching from your soil. So I'm going to just say here it's medium. All right. So then it asks you, what's the tolerable soil? So this is T. This is from the fact sheet. Okay. This is not the predicted soil loss from your fields. It's for the soil type itself and slope. Okay. And again, the district should be providing this information it's on the soil fact sheet. So for this field, it's 3. There's a place for notes if you want to fill in notes, but otherwise, update the field. Okay, and you have filled in all the data. Okay. Now you can see here, there's a spot to fill in your soil tests. You know, I'm not going to keep anybody from forging ahead. We'll be talking about soil tests next week, so we can fill those out, but feel free to, you know, add in your soil tests. There is a way to import soil tests, you know, in spreadsheets, which we'll get to again next week, or you can ask, you know, someone to help you out with that if you're ready. But this week, I want you to get all your fields in and all the soil, other soil information, map the field. That makes it a little bit easier. And then these details that are listed below. Okay, so that's your homework. That's under the fields tab. So again, we'll go back here. You're adding in all of your fields. Add a new field, add a new field. Okay, you'll see we're not filling out crops yet. We'll get to that next week. You know, of course, again, if you want to forge ahead, go ahead, fill in the crops and all that information. Happy for you to, you know, keep rolling ahead at your own pace. The only other piece I'd like you to fill out this week, I think, if you go to the dash bar to the farms, you can fill out equipment. And this is where you'll put in your manure spreaders. And even if they're not yours and they're a custom applicator, you would just add a spreader. Okay. So you have to name the spreader. This one. And add this year. What kind of spreader is it? Solid, semi-solid, liquid, or slurry? How many gallons does it hold? Now, if you put solid manure, it'll ask you how many tons it holds. And most people have to do a little calibration on that, or a little figuring. Is it calibrated? Okay, it is a requirement for you to calibrate your spreaders to really know what you're applying. You know, many liquid spreaders today have GPS technology and flow meters and ways to measure that more accurately. And even some of our solid spreaders, I would really encourage people to work with extension of the districts to really figure out how much, you know, how much manure you're applying, especially with your solid spreaders. It's really difficult to just estimate it visually. So definitely, we can help you estimate that, of course, but you know, those spreaders really need to be calibrated. And then, you know, are you using a custom applicator or not? Okay. And then you just save it. So if you can get all your spreaders in there this week, that would be great. And I think that's usually a good chunk of homework for people to make sure all their fields are in there. The soil information. Okay. I did it really quick. But again, if you're not mapping the fields, and sometimes even if you are, you have to hand enter all that information. So it could take some of you quite a bit of time. And, you know, depending on how many fields you have, this step can take a while, to get through. So why don't we just focus on getting all the fields in there this week? And again, adding in your spreaders. Certainly you can do more than that. Like I said, you know, you can add in your crops if you want, and soil tests. It's, you know, really up to you, but we'll be doing more of that next week. Okay.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
So, I mean, we have so many fields. It's a lot of data. Do they have any of the data stored from the last 2 or 3 management plans that we've done that I could pull in? or
should,
is there an archive somewhere?
I'm trying to remember the last time you guys came through the class, but if you have a goCrop account, it should still be there.
It was through a third party. You know what
Hmm.
I mean? Like the
No.
farm was, yeah. I might have a CD
Yeah.
of it, to see if he had it on a CSV file.
Yeah.
Well-
If you find something, Kim, reach out to us and,
And see if I can,
easier to
I
get the
mean,
data out of goCrop than to put data into it. So,
right.
but it usually is.
I mean, you know, you guys may know that better than I do, because, of what you have on file for McKnight Farm.
Yeah, I thought you guys took the class years ago, but we
Yeah,
can
I
we can
wouldn't
take a look.
know. I mean, I know Seth for sure hasn't taken the class in the last 12 years.
Yeah. Well, we've been doing
Yeah,
it for almost 20, so
okay. So he,
so we can
maybe
look.
he did when he first, but he always used a third party. I forget
Yeah,
what his name was. Yeah.
yeah. Okay.
So,
Um,
and I know Susan just wrote that, I mean, you can use Seth Gardner's email address because that's pretty much, but I'll give you a phone number.
yeah. I mean, we can look for sure and see what we have. But
Yeah,
um,
because I was just looking to see. I know I may even have the CD downloaded on my computer, and whether that would have any of the information. But
yeah, I don't know. We'd have to see what you have. But
Okay.
okay,
There was another question in the chat,
yeah,
Heather, and then I have a question.
yeah. So dragline type
Yep.
system on grass, it would be considered injected. I'm assuming unless it was broadcasting it. Otherwise, you can just put drag line into the spreader equipment. And yeah. What's your
Okay.
question?
My
Susan?
question is, since we're ending and this is done for the day, I wanted to ask about the breakout sessions, or at least give options. I believe there's 2 breakout sessions that I can set up now, or we can take a 20-minute break, have lunch, and then I can set it up. I just wanted to let our people know that we're planning on going in a breakout session. I'll probably go ahead and set them up now, one for Stephen in Middlebury and one for David and Lindsay. So I just kind of wanted to announce that. I'll do it now. Thank you.